Okay, great. So I'm going to start the broadcast. I'll read a very short intro and then throw it over to Hudson, and then I'll control the deck and move it through as we take the discussion.
Ready to go.
All right.
I don't see it, but
it might take a few minutes or a few seconds to get to you.
yeah, go ahead and get started. I have a printed copy here. I can catch up.
Okay, fantastic.
When my
okay.
computer does.
Sounds good. Well, I'm going to open up the broadcast for everyone now then.
Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar for the Data Act and the Future of Federal Open Data. We have a number of excellent presenters today. Our moderator is Hudson Hollister, Executive Director from the Data Transparency Coalition. As well, we have Richard Gregg, Fiscal Assistant Secretary, former from the U.S. Treasury, Danny Werfel, former Commissioner and former Controller from the Internal Revenue Service and the Office of Management and Budget, and Mike Wood, former Executive Director for U.S. Recovery and Accountability Board. This is an interactive webinar. We welcome all of your questions. Please feel free to use the questions and GoToWebinar to send them to us, and we'll collect them and ask them at the end of the presentation. So right now, I'd like to turn it over to Hudson. Hudson, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'm excited to be here and excited to lead this discussion with these distinguished panelists, and I'll tell you in a minute why it is so interesting that we have the particular panelists with us that we do. Jessica, let's move along to the next slide, please. I'm the Executive Director of the Data Transparency Coalition, and I'll tell you just for a minute what our job is. Our organization, which is made up of technology companies like Socrata, seeks to persuade the government to transform its own information. Our organization lobbies Congress and tries to persuade the federal executive branch to replace disconnected documents with open data. We believe that if government adopts consistent data formats for its information and consistently publishes that information, then both government and society are benefited. Our topic today is the Data Act, which is the first ever open data law. Congress unanimously passed the Data Act in May 2014. The Data Act, which is an acronym for Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, is a government-wide mandate for the executive branch to transform all of its spending information from documents into searchable data. Now, we'll go into some detail about what the Data Act does to try to accomplish that transformation, but for now, just be aware that the Data Act covers spending information. Jessica, let's go backward to the introductory slide. I had one other thing to mention. I'd like you all to know who you've got with you on this webinar, because they'll be very interesting for as to be answering your questions. We've got the when you talk about the Data Act and you consider who is in charge of implementing it in government right now, the people who are on this webinar are the immediate predecessors of those officials. Dick Gregg, until June 2014, was the Fiscal Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department. Dick's successor, Dave Liebrick, is now in charge for the Treasury Department of the Data Act. Similarly, Danny Werfel, who is with us right here in this webinar today, formerly served as the Controller at the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. Danny's successor, Dave Mader, is responsible at the White House for the implementation of the Data Act. And finally, Mike Wood served as Executive Director of the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board, which was the temporary agency that was set up in order to oversee the spending of stimulus money when Congress passed the stimulus law in 2009. And we'll get into some more detail later on. The work that the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board did to make stimulus spending fully transparent and searchable, that was the precedent for what the Data Act now requires for all federal spending. So I'd like you all to be aware and to feel free to lob tough questions at Dick, at Danny, and at Mike, because they will know the answers. Now let's move on to the next slide. Why are we all here today? We're here because of the Data Act, and I'll explain, and then some of our panelists will talk about a very brief history of the Data Act. I know sometimes when you listen to a webinar and the same voice goes on for a bit too long, you can tend to zone out, even if the things that voice is saying are fascinating. And so I'll try to run through this very quickly so we can get to our panelists. As I mentioned, the Data Act is the first open data law in the United States. It is the first legislative mandate enacted by Congress that requires the government to standardize and to publish a particular type of information. And in the Data Act's case, we are talking about spending. The Data Act requires the government to standardize and to publish spending information. Now, how do we do that? The Data Act mandate requires the Treasury Department and the White House to work together to come up with common data fields and a common data format for spending information. And now when we say spending information, we're referring to a number of different types of reports that existed already, but that now for the first time will become fully searchable. The Data Act requires the Treasury Department and the White House to set up these consistent data standards for the accounting information that agencies report to Treasury, the budget information that they report to the White House, and the grant and contract summaries that they report to various government-wide databases. Now, these common data fields and common data formats don't just apply to the information that agencies have to report, they also apply to the information that grantees and contractors have to report. So if any of you work for a state government or local government that receives federal grants, or if you work for a company that receives federal contracts, the entity you work for is responsible already before the Data Act to report various types of information about how it spends those federal funds. The Data Act sets up consistent data standards for that information too. And so what you need to know when you think about the data standards is that they cover information that has to be reported by agencies and also information that has to be reported by grantees and contractors. Now, so far I've talked about standardization, but the Data Act is really about two things. First step, standardize. Second step, publish. The Data Act provides that once we've got all of this information fully searchable, once we have consistent data fields and a consistent data format for all of these details, then the whole corpus of the information has to be published on usaspending.gov. Right now, usaspending.gov only has a summary of each grant and a summary of each contract. Under the Data Act, it will expand to include not just grant and contract spending, but also internal spending on things like salaries, although it won't cover individual employee salaries. And it will also allow far more searchability than it does now. We'll get into more details about usaspending.gov later on, but for now, let's move on to some observations by our panelists. First, since we've got the experts here, we're going to dig into some detail about how spending was managed internally before the Data Act. And for that, Dick Gregg, we'd like to go over to you. As Fiscal Assistant Secretary for many years, what were the primary ways in which you took in spending reports from the agencies?
I think, Hudson, there were a number of things, and the major point was that what we had were separate buckets of data that we used to try to get a view of spending. And the other thing is that these were not tied together. One primary source of information was the spending reports that came from periodic updates from our budget office, and almost by definition those were not timely. There was a lag of some weeks and sometimes more than that, and it was in many cases fairly summary information. Another source of information we had was from individual projects. Again, those were from periodic reports on how a particular project was going, how much money was going out the door for various parts of a project. And they also were not tied together to any program. They weren't linked to, say, another project that someone else is working on in the same program. So it was a very stovepiped system. And then the third category that I mentioned is that Treasury makes very large payments on behalf of other government agencies. So we had volume information and dollar amounts for payments going out, but a lot of that was at a very summary level and not conducive to any kind of good data analytics. So in retrospect, I think back of just how difficult and how blind we were, and in most cases still are today, in trying to manage our spending data for large agencies like Treasury and others.
Dick, Greg, thanks very much. I think we'd like to get observations from others on the panel on digging more deeply into this. If the information available internally to the people in charge of the Treasury Department about federal spending was separated, what were some of the consequences of that? What were some of the limitations? Now, Jessica, I want to make sure, we've got observations from all of the panelists? Yes, we do. Okay, great. We've got a view from a Treasury veteran, Dick Gregg, from a Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board veteran, Mike Wood, and from a White House veteran, Danny Werfel on this. Let's go to Mike next. Mike, could you give us the view of some of the background of what you needed to do when you were running the Recovery Board, why the Recovery Board needed this information, and then explain how it was limited?
Yeah, the Recovery Act, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, required that we publish data, make data transparent on how the stimulus money was being spent. So we had to have a good way to access that and to tell the public exactly how the government was spending it, where the money was going. That was of great interest, obviously. If you think back to 2009, we were in very difficult financial times in America. So they wanted to spend money quickly, and they wanted to distribute it across the country, so we had to show where it was going. Unfortunately, there wasn't a good set of systems in place in the federal government to provide that. We could have gotten that information. It would have taken us a long time. Dick mentioned the delay in getting some of the data. We didn't really have good real-time data. The law, the Recovery Act actually required quarterly reporting. So we had to set up a separate system to collect that data from recipients and post that data, which we did. It was very successful. It worked. But it was an unusual effort, and it was sort of one of the predecessors to the Data Act on transparency. But it was a different way of doing business. Some of my comments on the slide here are from my previous life, both at EPA and the Department of Interior as well, where, you know, spending information is difficult to collect. Dick mentioned some of the problems with it. The Data Act is going to actually open up information at the project level and at the object class level, which is very, very granular. Previously, although you could get a hold of spending data. It was difficult to do. It was difficult to analyze and search in a very quick or rapid manner, in a comprehensive manner. And there were a lot of data calls that come in the government, what specific types of travel and things like that that are difficult to for agencies to put together. That if the Data Act is implemented properly, we should be able to use analytics and put some of that information together in a fairly simple and fast way.
Now let's zoom back for just a second and illuminate why it might be difficult for the Recovery Board or under the current system to pull together information relating to a particular program. Mike, what were the different, if you were, say when you were at the EPA or when you were at the Recovery Board and you wanted to pull together information about spending on a particular federal program, what were the different sources you might go to?
Well, you might go to the financial systems in the agencies, which is the sort of the definitive set of data on spending. You might go to the program offices, which actually run the programs. They have a good feel for how things are going and what's happening. A lot of those use legacy systems. They're older systems. They're not really modern pieces of software that are agile or that let you do a lot of analysis and so forth. They just keep the basic data. And part of the problem with that is the lag in time. You've got information, data comes in, or you receive a budget. It takes a while to spend it by the end of the fiscal year, and then it takes a while to record the expenditures. Also, another major problem is just defining what a program is. Each agency can define programs to some extent. Some of them are defined by law, but there's a number of different programs. So when you say program, that becomes difficult. That becomes part of what we're trying to grapple with when we establish standards under the Data Act. What is a program? What are the list of programs? And how are you going to collect that information?
That's absolutely right. Jumping ahead for a second, the Data Act envisions that we'll have a consistent data field that identifies programs. So regardless of whether the information comes from the financial systems Mike talks about or from the program management systems that Mike talks about, if the data field is the same, then you can automatically pull together information that pertains to a particular program. Much easier said than done, but that's the goal, which we'll talk about more later on, that the law moves toward. Now let's get a White House perspective. Danny Werfel, former controller of OMB, how would you describe the limitations of the spending tracking systems that are in place today?
Well, thank you, Hudson. I think there's a real interesting history here that I'd like to kind of quickly touch on in answering your question. If we go back to 2005, 2006, when the Transparency Act, the predecessor to the Data Act, was enacted, it was actually enacted very quickly. It was drafted up by then Senators Coburn and Obama. They had this vision of a Google for Government type solution where you could search by any name, whether it be General Motors or the state of Arizona, and you'd see all the federal dollars that went to that entity. And it got enacted very quickly. We were at the White House, and this was during the Bush administration, trying to understand some of the implications, but this is one of those rare moments where where things move more quickly than they typically do, and the bill was on the president's desk. And what we quickly realized once we had to enact the bill was that there were a lot of challenges that we just weren't ready for to meet the requirements of federal spending transparency, and most notably was the systems that we had in place that track agency finances are somewhat stubborn and narrow in what they can and can't do. And the systems that we have set up in the government were built over years to do a very narrow set of activities around producing traditional financial statements, tracking expenditures, but doing it in a very specific type of an accounting and budgeting structure that didn't translate easily over to the very plain language, clear view that the Transparency Act had in mind. And so we quickly found that agencies couldn't just hit that button on their financial systems or on their IT systems and produce these these clear language and plain language spending reports. Instead, they had to kind of cobble together the information in a non-automated way. And that has two implications in financial management. One is it takes time and is more expensive because you have people working with a lot of elbow grease to get the information, and they could be doing other things like analytics and other things. The other implication is that it's less reliable. You know, automated solutions, as most auditors will tell you, sometimes agencies lose their clean audit opinions and get cited for audits because they're doing too many manual processes and not enough automated processes. So we ended up just kind of not being nimble enough to have our systems answer the questions, and also the quality control mechanisms that we had in place around data reliability were also built and designed for traditional financial statements and traditional accounting, not this vision of Google for government and this type of kind of user-friendly spending information. And so really what the Data Act was, in my opinion, was a reaction and a corrective action to this reality. And it was smart that people like you and Mike Wood and others who were feeding the thought process into what to do here realized that a more data-centric solution was the way to go to try to fix the problem moving forward. And I think we're going to get into some of that as we get deeper into the slide deck.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, we should have a chance to do that. Let's move on for now. And that's one of the first things that we'll get into. Now, understanding that what the Data Act does, that it tries to set up consistent data fields and consistent data formats for that whole mass of separate systems that we've talked about. What impact will that have? What impact will the Data Act have on data quality? And Danny, you were just talking about how it is so difficult to reconcile and to audit. If the Data Act is fully implemented over the next few years, what will change?
Yeah, so again, going back to my point, you know, when we were in the reality that the technology systems that we had in place were not answering the mail on the Transparency Act, we could have enacted legislation or come up with an approach to kind of re-engineer all of our technology in order to correct the problem. But the Data Act is a much smarter approach, which gets at normalizing and standardizing the data. And what that does is it enables a much more fluid and rational reconciliation process, because one of the challenges in kind of establishing the reliability of the information, you know, one of the mechanisms, as an example, is to establish a spending control total for an agency. Let's just use an example. Let's say we're going to establish a control total that the Department of Energy spent $10 million in the month of July 2015. So that's our control total. And now we want to make sure that we know all the individual transactions that build up to that $10 million control total, and so that we can essentially reconcile that there's nothing missing. So now you go into the department, you stick with this example, you go into the Department of Energy's transaction information and you start to try to build a, you know, that reconciliation. And if the information is not standard, if it's not co-located in a logical fashion, if you can't quickly understand what the different transactions mean and what their purpose was, then you spend a lot of time kind of building the putting the puzzle pieces together to get to that $10 million total, rather than very quickly and efficiently relating all the various transactions to that $10 million total, and therefore quickly finding any gaps in the data. When you have non-standard data, gaps might be explainable by the fact that you're working to figure out why two different types of data don't relate to one another, but the spending might actually be there. So it gets very messy if you don't have standard information. And so we're really looking at a game changer if we can get the right standards across this data for quick, almost lightning quick control total reconciliations that can help us pinpoint any issues or anomalies or missing data points. Very, very different than the legwork and manual process and kind of iteration we do over and over again on the data today in order to figure out what the gaps might be.
That's great. It's really helpful to know for those who are in a non-federal, come from a non-federal background, that so much of what has to be done to manage public funds today, like control total reconciliation, requires manual legwork, and that there's a hope that if we have consistent data standards for the information in these existing systems coming in, control total reconciliation and similar tasks could be automated. Let's go to Dick Gregg, former Fiscal Assistant Secretary. Dick, what's your perspective on the impact the Data Act standards could have for data quality?
Well, I think they're the foundation of which we need to build, and it's something that that should have been done years ago. I think when you look at a lot of other industries, they have a lot of standards, and for one reason or another, we haven't gotten there in the federal area. I mean, just the lack of standards, and going back to Mike's point earlier about trying to identify program costs. When I was at Treasury a few years ago, my boss came to me and said, well, how much, this is before the bankruptcy of Detroit, and she said, well, how much is the federal government sending to the city of Detroit? And I told her an answer right away, which is, we don't know. And I knew that based on just what we've been talking about, because of the not having standards, the inability to easily tie programs together. Within Treasury, we did some reverse engineering, and I told her it was probably 75% accurate, and OMB did a data call, which is very time consuming. But all those things are kind of hidden from the public as costs, and those of us in the federal service just in some ways just managed with the best we could with the siloed system, non-standard data, and as Danny said, the difficulty of pulling all that together in some kind of comprehensive and clear and presentable fashion was daunting, and what happened within my organization, I think is true across the board, is when you wanted to make a change, make an improvement, you didn't have the data available. So the first thing you did was did a study and tried to collect the data and to get it in and hopefully manage it in a way and review it carefully and knock out the anomalies, so you got something that was capable of helping you make a decision. But it's an ongoing difficult process, and I think the Data Act really is the first thing that in my 40 years of Treasury service that I see as something that is going to be a great tool for federal managers and policymakers.
Thanks very much, Dick. Let's go to Mike real quick and then move on to the next question. Mike, your thoughts on how the Data Act could impact the quality of spending data?
Yeah, I think just a couple of quick points. I think, and I've been talking to a lot of agencies and Treasury, and they're working very, very hard, and they're emphasizing quality, by the way, which is a very, very good thing in that they want, as they implement this, the data that they're collecting and they're going to display to be good data. Some of it probably won't be perfect early on, some of the initial displays, but they're really taking some steps to try and put some procedures in place to improve the type of information that they're going to collect and display. But I think I just reiterate what Danny and Dick have both said, that hopefully as you get better data, these agencies will be able to do better management. For the first time, they'll be seeing some of the data across organizations within a department, which is unusual. Within specific programs, they've always sort of understood how their programs work, but as you roll up the data, it became difficult. Now I think they're going to have some capability to do that, and if the information is in good shape, they'll be able to do a better job at managing for results. I also think one of the things I stressed at the Recovery Board was making things easily understandable for the public, and I think that's a second sort of goal that not only will agencies and hopefully state and other recipients of grants and loans will have a better picture of what's going on, but also the public will have a better picture. And once the public starts looking at things, you want that data to be in good shape because you're subject to being questioned about it once it's out there, once it's open. And that's one of the beauties, I think, of open government. When you tell people what you're doing, they can ask some valid questions, and you're going to have to be able to answer those, so that you need good quality data.
All right, let's zero in a little more on the topic of data standards, and we're going to stick with Mike. Again, let's reiterate that what the Data Act does is it doesn't change any systems. It doesn't change any of the reporting requirements that Dick or Danny or Mike have been talking about. Instead, it just says we're going to identify programs the same way across the government. We're going to identify accounting categories the same way across the government. We're going to identify the entities that receive grants and contracts the same way across the government. And indeed, that's happening. On May 8th, 2015, the Treasury Department and OMB, led by Dick's successor, Fiscal Assistant Secretary Dave Liebrick, and Danny's successor, Controller Dave Mader, announced exactly that. On May 8th, Treasury and OMB announced 57 data elements for such concepts as program, recipient, accounting line item that will need to be expressed consistently across the board. Now, let's figure out why that was so important, why that announcement on May 8th from Treasury and OMB was so important, and why it's so crucial that it be followed by agencies. Mike, why are federal data standards for spending so important?
Well, one of my comments was the simple answer is it allows interoperability. You can actually compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges. So it allows for people to do valid comparisons between information across the government or across programs. And it basically forms a foundation or a baseline for understanding how the spending is happening. You're using the same set of language, everybody's using the same terms. Think about if the Department of Agriculture used euros and the Department of Transportation used dollars. Every time you had to look at their figures, you'd have to stop and think and do a conversion and so forth. Well, that's kind of where standards come in. We're all using US dollars. That's one standard. That's an obvious, easy thing to understand. I also put down a little facetious comment here. It's 2015, not 1815. Government changes very slowly. I'm actually very heartened in talking to my former colleagues in the government that they're, this is not a technology issue. The technology is available to do this. It's more of a workflow and a cultural issue, and I think the government is making a major leap forward in transparency and setting up these standards. And I think long term, if you can set up standards for financial data, you can set up standards for a lot of information that the government will be making available in an open format. So that's sort of my short view of why it should be now that we're setting up standards and why they're important.
Let's get a similar view from former Fiscal Assistant Secretary Dick Gregg. Dick, why would you say that data standards for spending are important? And if it is so important, what are some of the reasons why there's been no mandate up until 2014 when the Data Act became law?
I think that, as I said earlier, this is foundational. Without agencies using common data standards, we're going to continue to deal with what others would call reporting errors, simply because one agency might define an obligation one way and another agency define it another way and a third one a third way. So I think until we get that kind of consistency, we're going to be not providing what may be considered accurate within an agency, but in fact, if you look across the government, it's you know, there are differences. The issue here, I think, is a recognition that there's a couple year implementation for the Data Act, and I agree with Mike's comment that I think Treasury and OMB have done a good job. The important thing to emphasize, however, is that this is a long-term change and transformation. And how far we get in 2 years, I'm not sure. But these data standards are going to be living in embryonic, because they're going to change as over time, and they're going to grow, and that's good. But we need a foundation. I think, going back to the other part of your question, why not earlier? It's sometimes it takes a mandate to make these things happen. I mean, Treasury's had U.S. Standard General Ledger in place for years and years, and there's still, in some cases, different interpretations. In other cases, agencies aren't following. So I think it takes organizations like the Data Transparency Coalition and Congress keeping an eye on the progress, and again, Treasury and OMB are doing a great job, but the oversight is important. I know I went to Treasury to help implement the Debt Collection Improvement Act of 1996, and it was across the government, very challenging, and it just kept a lot of prodding from Treasury and working with the agencies, but a lot of oversight by Congress as well.
Thanks very much, Dick. Greg, let's ask Danny the same question from the perspective of having tried to bring together budget reports at the White House Office of Management and Budget, Office of Federal Financial Management. Why is standardization important?
Well, I mean, it's very important, because what ends up happening is we're working harder than we should in government to achieve basic management disciplines that are necessary to ensure that we're good stewards of taxpayer dollars. I mean, if you think about, you know, let me give you some examples. The government has had a tremendous amount of challenge implementing basic financial systems. Just putting them in place in federal agencies has taken many more years than a citizen would expect, and cost much more money than originally anticipated. Again, just to put in basic accounting systems. And when you try to figure out why that is, when you do a root cause analysis, one of the main causes of why it's so hard is because these technologies don't necessarily do as well when they're pulling together disparate non-standard data. We try to push very diverse types of data through these technology solutions, and it fails. And so we have to go back and clean the data and retry again over and over again. And what you see in these agencies is a lot of data cleansing to get through, and corresponding to that, these big, heavy technology solutions that are really chugging and working hard to pull together these types of data. So we're working hard at the ground level to clean the data, and we're investing in big, heavy, bulky technologies to gather the data. And the same thing goes with basic data analytics and data searches. You know, we have questions like Dick's question earlier in terms of how much money is going to Detroit. You know, when I was in the White House, an example that a lot of people will remember is we suddenly needed to know, to answer public questions and to answer questions from Congress, how much are we spending on conferences, training-related conferences, because we had an issue at one of our agencies and we needed to now understand what was going on across all the agencies. And it was, again, because the raw materials weren't there. you had a lot of agencies doing a lot of data cleaning, a lot of manual collection, and going to much more effort than you would want an agency to do to answer basic spending questions. So how do you solve for this? And I think a very logical and smart approach is a data-centric approach. And if we can create the right raw materials within our agencies from a data standpoint, then we're going to work less hard to get a higher benefit. And so as an example, we're going to be able to implement accounting systems that are lighter technologies, more agile technologies, so less expensive and more flexible without the corresponding heavy legwork to clean all the data. To answer basic questions that come up around where our spending is going, again, we'll work less hard to answer those basic questions because the information will be able to analyze it, pivot it, use it differently and kind of with more versatility because we've put in the work to make sure that the raw materials of the data are standardized and don't require all the extra work of cleaning and aligning. So that doesn't mean that we don't have a big investment in front of us, but it's a very worthwhile investment, and that investment in driving those standards is going to enable all types of benefits in the midterm and in the long term for future governments to be able to leverage more agile technologies, to be able to answer many, many more questions in a more seamless way about where our money is going than they can today.
That's great, and that gets into one of the next questions I want to get to. Jessica, let's skip over the very next one, the impact on federal agencies of data standards, because we've talked about that pretty thoroughly. Let's move on to the question after that about what benefits citizens may see from the Data Act. And I think it's really important. The panelists so far have really focused on what the Data Act means internally. If the government adopts consistent data fields and consistent data formats for spending, here is all the time savings we'll have internally. Here's how internal managers will be able to use analytics. Here's how we'll be able to answer questions without data calls. This is a whole bunch of internal management efficiency we've been talking about so far. But when you look at the political process and the reason why Congress decided unanimously to pass the Data Act, they were thinking more about public accountability and citizen transparency than they were about these internal management topics. So Mike, let's ask you first. How do you think that this transformation from disconnected documents to open standardized data benefits citizens, and how does that relate to the internal management efficiencies we've been talking about already?
Well, hopefully people, the U.S. citizens and people living in America will be able to see how the government is spending their money. And Dick mentioned, how much money went to Detroit when they went bankrupt. You've got situations today, Ferguson, Missouri, you've got Baltimore, Maryland, where there's major issues. And it's very, very difficult for people to see, how much money is going to those areas in law enforcement, in health, in education, in environment, in all those categories, job training that may help with problems that are arising. And if you have good sets of data in understandable formats, people could see that and decide whether there needs to be a change in funding or a change in the way the government is spending money. So, a democratic debate requires information. Information is power. Everyone needs information to make informed decisions. So I think hopefully there'll be information that will allow people to view whether they think the government is doing things that don't make sense, or whether there's redundancy that should be gotten rid of. And I think you'll be seeing that for the first time. People right now today have very, very high-level summary information that doesn't really let them make informed decisions the way you'd like to. It's not like state and local governments I'm from New England, where you used to be able to get up at a town meeting and actually see what was happening in the budget and talk about it. The federal government is so big, they've lost that capability. And hopefully, if you have open data, that'll bring some of that back, that people can ask not only what questions, but what if questions.
Yes.
And be able to get answers.
Let's ask this same question to Dick Gregg, former Fiscal Assistant Secretary. And these explanations have been so great, we're not going to have time to get to all of the questions on the slide deck. But if you've been following along, you can see that there are some very interesting observations in this slide deck. It's more than your typical slide deck. And so we'll make sure that Socrata makes this slide deck available on the webinar page in case you'd like to go back and review that and absorb that in addition to listening to all of us. But for now, let's go to Dick to ask about the benefits citizens will see, and after that, one more question, and then one long slide to the benediction. So, Dick, what benefits do you think citizens will see from the Data Act?
I think that when you have kind of the ongoing difficulty of public confidence in the federal government, and whether you feel that's warranted or unwarranted, anytime you have things like USA spending where the numbers as reflected by a GAO report don't add up, I think it damages the credibility and the trust and confidence that the American people should have in how their government is managed. So that's number one. Number two, there's an opportunity to point out anomalies. And when you get this level of granularity, and you're going to have some segment of the public paying attention, they're going to raise questions to agencies that are going to be difficult to answer, maybe uncomfortable to answer, but nevertheless I think is a very important element. And thirdly, I just mention is that when I was down at the AGA conference in Nashville a month or so ago, one of the not-for-profits mentioned the benefits of having better data on what is being spent, for example, but at the federal level for disaster relief, so they could better coordinate their response. I think those are the sort of things that resonate with me.
Great. Let's move to one more question. Let's ask everybody about the remaining issues that are going to require solving. I think that's going to be one more question after this, Jessica, the next one along. The Data Act sets up a time frame. Let's make sure that's clear. The Data Act requires agencies to start using these consistent fields and formats within 2 years after they were announced. So there is a deadline of May 9th, 2017 for agencies to adopt these consistent data standards for all the information that they are reporting to Treasury, to OMB, to government-wide databases. Now, the Data Act, if you look at it that way, is one of the largest management changes that Congress has imposed ever since the CFO Act became law in the 1990s, requiring agencies to put together financial statements in the first place. So given that this is a multi-year effort and it's a major effort, what are the challenges that we see in having all these changes actually happen? Let's go with Mike first.
Okay, yeah, I think to me, I see, just having worked on this with agencies and some of my day-to-day work, I think the award ID linkage, this is getting specific, but how we're going to track grants and contracts across from program systems, which are sometimes legacy systems, they're not modern systems that lend themselves to analytics, to financial systems. That's going to be a difficult lift for the federal government. They're working on that. I think grants presents a major issue because they're managed and the data that was collected is sort of in a different format. There's a lot of unstructured data that's descriptive information that's collected. It's going to be a difficult process to sort of manage that in a standardized format. And I know HHS is now working with OMB on a pilot. People should avail themselves of an opportunity to comment on that. but that's going to be a major issue. And then the question, some of my background in federal law enforcement and accountability, will the IGs, will law enforcement have sufficient data and sufficient analytical capability to look and prevent fraud and waste in federal spending like we did with the Recovery Act? So those are sort of three issues that I think still need some thinking through.
Thanks very much. Let's ask that same question of Danny Werfel from the standpoint of somebody who had to work on big changes when you were running federal budget reporting as head of the Office of Federal Financial Management at the White House. What are the big challenges that the Data Act poses for financial managers in the federal government?
Well, I think you can look at the Data Act through two lenses, not to oversimplify, but two lenses. One is that the Data Act is going to help address ongoing deficiencies in federal spending transparency. That if you go on usaspending.gov today, you're not going to have the type of experience that was envisioned when the Act was first passed, because the site isn't as user-friendly as it could be, doesn't have as rich a set of information as was originally envisioned, and there's data quality problems, and as a taxpayer that the government agencies are spending more than they should to provide the data into the system. So one lens of the Data Act is, and it's a really important lens, is it's a corrective action that's going to solve for the problems that I just talked about. And that's going to be a lift. I mean, there's going to be a lot of hard work that goes into making sure that the Data Act achieves the solutions that it was intended to achieve to fix federal spending transparency. But I think we make a mistake if we just limit it to that lens, because a second lens you can look at, a much broader lens, is that we're starting down a path of data standardization that can not only correct federal spending transparency deficiencies, but broader deficiencies that we have in financial management in answering questions. For example, what is the cost of various critical activities that we undertake in the government? And once we understand those costs, we're better able to benchmark them, understand where we're being inefficient, and start to drive corrective actions and targets and goals around reducing costs. These are very, very critical questions that again, we have deficiencies in our current financial management, and I'm hopeful that the Data Act serves as a trigger point to correct, obviously, its primary purpose, spending transparency, but also that we're thinking strategically about how to start down this journey in a way that we also close other gaps in our ever evolving efforts to perfect financial management in the U.S. government.
Thanks very much, Danny. And I'll just add, from our perspective, from the Data Transparency Coalition's vantage point, as we represent the tech industry, trying to make sure that the Data Act is fully implemented, there are a few challenges that could doom this effort, and if we are able to confront them successfully, they will be overcome. First, our coalition has been hoping to communicate to federal agencies that it's not too expensive to take their existing information and match it to the data standards. To be sure, if we were to try to upgrade all of the financial systems and all of the award systems, that's an incredibly expensive proposition. But for now, all the law really requires is for agencies to export the information and then map it. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that the law requires OMB, some of Danny's former colleagues, to run a pilot program to test whether the data standards work for grantee and contractor reporting. So OMB's job here is to take a subgroup of perhaps volunteer grantees and volunteer contractors and have them report the information using the common data standards. We haven't seen that happen yet. OMB has not announced when it will start having grantees and contractors actually submit their information in the data formats and fields in order to test whether the standards work or not. And if that doesn't happen, then we're never actually going to see the grantee reporting and contractor reporting part of the Data Act come to fruition. And then finally, there is, as Dick pointed out, there is responsibility with Congress. Congress needs to keep asking whether this is happening, because Congress unfortunately has a tendency to impose changes and then not fund them, or to impose changes and then forget about it and not follow up. And so the success ultimately of the Data Act really hinges on whether Congress does that. Now we have a few minutes left, just a few, because we've had so many great observations during this webinar. And so I'd like to find out, Jessica, are we getting any questions coming through from the audience that we can toss to our panelists?
We are. We have one question here, and we only have a few minutes, so unfortunately have to keep our answers short. But the big question that people have been asking is, do you think the upfront cost of implementing these standards will be balanced out by long-term savings?
Let's go with Dick on that one. Dick, Greg, what do you think?
Not even close. I think the benefits are going to be huge, and I think, as you pointed out, there's a way to do this without redoing all their existing systems.
Thanks very much, Dick. Jessica, any other questions from the audience?
That was actually the main one, so I think we're good. And I'd like to thank you guys for coming on this. Danny, Mike, and Dick, thank you so much. And Hudson, thank you so much for moderating. We have information on the screen for Socrata and the Data Coalition. And if you'd like to see slides and a video of this presentation, it'll be available on the Socrata.com website within the next 48 hours. So thank you very much, gentlemen. This was a very interesting presentation.
Thanks very much to all. Have a great afternoon/morning if you're in the East West Coast.
Thank you. Thanks, Hudson and Mike and Danny.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And with that, I will close the webinar.